At just 7 years old, Diana's life shattered as her parents' bitter divorce left her longing for a sense of home she would never find. But who could have imagined that the cracks in her childhood would shape the lonely princess the world came to adore? Tonight, we start her story not with royalty, but with heartbreak, a childhood stolen, and a spotlight she couldn't escape. What happens when the dream of being a princess becomes a nightmare? Let's uncover Diana's quiet struggles, layer by layer. By the time Diana turned 7, her life, which looked polished on the outside, had already been rattled by chaos. Born into the aristocratic Spencer family, she was surrounded by the wealth and elegance of the Althorpe estate, with rolling green acres, ornate rooms, and centuries of tradition etched into the very walls. From afar, it might have seemed idyllic, but inside, the air at Althorpe was heavy with tension. Fractured relationships, icy silences, and a sense that something was off long before Diana could fully piece it together herself. Her parents, Francis and Johnny Spencer, later the 8th Earl Spencer, were locked in a marriage that had curdled long before anyone uttered the word divorce. By the time they finally split, Diana was too young to understand why there were so many raised voices behind closed doors, why her mother was often crying, or why her father's frustration lingered in every corner. She only knew that things were breaking apart and that no one could stop it. At one point, Francis tried to take Diana and her siblings to London with her, leaving the estate. But her own mother testified against her in court, siding with Johnny, a betrayal that Francis never forgave. The result? Johnny Spencer won custody, and Diana watched her mother leave, not knowing when or if she would return. It's hard to imagine how confusing and painful that must have been for someone so young. On the surface, Althorpe remained a grand home, the kind that could swallow you whole if you stood in its halls long enough. But beneath its grandeur, it became a quiet and lonely place for Diana. Her father, while dutiful in his role, was emotionally distant. He had his responsibilities to the estate, his title, and his new marriage to Rain, Countess of Dartmouth, a woman Diana would later famously dislike. Rain's arrival didn't bring comfort or joy to the Spencer children. Instead, it created a new layer of emotional displacement. Diana felt as though she'd lost her mother all over again, replaced not by someone warm and loving, but by someone she found cold and unwelcoming. Diana struggled deeply with feelings of abandonment during this time, feelings that didn't fade as she grew older. Experts on childhood trauma often talk about how early attachment disruptions can ripple into adulthood, creating a need for reassurance or validation that never really gets met. It's not hard to see how this might have planted a seed in Diana's heart, a constant quiet ache for love and belonging. She wanted to be seen, heard, and cared for in ways that her childhood didn't quite offer. Yet, the people in her orbit seemed to keep failing her, one after another. Even so, Diana learned to put on a brave front, as children often do. Growing up in the British aristocracy, there was an expectation to keep emotions tucked away, to smooth the wrinkles from your dress, smile politely, and keep going. She went to boarding school and tried to embrace some level of normalcy, but even there, things weren't right. She wasn't the academic overachiever her parents might have hoped for, and she often felt invisible in the shadow of her older sisters. Shy and self-conscious, she struggled to find her footing, her place, her people. But here's the thing about growing up in isolation and emotional uncertainty. It doesn't teach you how to set healthy boundaries or how to recognize when someone's love for you is conditional. You spend so much time yearning for the next moment of approval that you'll almost do anything to get it. For Diana, this need for connection would come to define so much of her later life, especially her relationships. Still, it's important to understand that Diana's childhood was not entirely defined by gloom. There were moments when she flourished in the small joys of everyday life. She developed a strong protective instinct for her younger brother Charles and took pride in making him laugh. She loved music and dancing, activities that gave her a sense of freedom she craved in an otherwise rigid existence. But no matter how much laughter she shared or warmth she sought, there always seemed to be a shadow trailing behind her. Althorpe, for all its riches, never felt like home in the way a child so desperately needs. You can imagine, then, how the search for love and stability became something Diana carried with her into adulthood. The foundations had been shaky from the start, and while she had no idea what lay ahead, marriage, motherhood, fame, deep down, you get the sense she was already looking for something solid to stand on, something no one could take away. Unfortunately for Diana, the path she chose, or perhaps the path she was thrust into, only magnified these wounds, turning her longing into a painful public spectacle later in life. Diana herself would later reflect on her childhood with a mix of wistfulness and sorrow. One of the rare quotes about her early years reveals how keenly she felt the loss of her mother. The age of 7 was a very big occasion, very unhappy. Even in adulthood, as a global icon and humanitarian, that 7-year-old girl still lived inside her. She had never truly let go of the loneliness she experienced then, and it shaped much of who she became. It's fascinating and heartbreaking to think about how her story might have unfolded differently if she had felt more grounded during those formative years. Research has shown that children who grow up in unstable environments often become sensitive to rejection in ways that make trusting others difficult. Diana was no exception. Her future relationships would reflect a deep desire for closeness, yet a fear of not being enough. Even her role as a mother would echo this, as she worked tirelessly to create the kind of nurturing, loving environment for her sons that she always wanted for herself. By the time Diana became an adult, she carried these early experiences with her like a scar. Obvious to no one but herself, yet always present. The long corridors of Althorpe and the haunting absence of her mother left holes that even the grandest brick walls couldn't fill. When she met Prince Charles years later, her heart likely believed it had found the anchor it needed. Little did she know that this search for connection would soon collide with the icy, institutional expectations of royal life, and that the cracks in her foundation would only deepen when exposed to the weight of a crown. If you think about it, Diana's early years, the longing, the instability, the search for approval, weren't all that far removed from what millions of others go through. But where most of us get to wrestle with these things privately, Diana didn't have that luxury. From the moment she said yes to a prince, her whole life became a story played out in front of the world. The dream had a price, and it was one she was still too young to calculate. 19 is an age most of us spend figuring out who we are. For Diana, it was the age her life stopped being her own. She'd been working at a London kindergarten, living in a shared flat with friends, and enjoying the kind of independence that felt thrilling for someone shy and quietly ambitious. But everything changed after she caught Prince Charles's eye. To everyone around her, it seemed like a storybook moment. The dashing prince, the shy beauty. But as we know, not every fairy tale gets its happy ending. Diana's began with a whirlwind, and where there's a whirlwind, There are always things that get swept under the rug. They'd met before, of course. Years earlier, when Diana was just 16, she'd been introduced to Charles. Back then, he was actually dating her older sister, Sarah. If you're imagining a light bulb moment where his attention shifted to Diana and Cupid's arrow struck, that's not exactly how it happened. Their paths crossed a few more times before things changed in the summer of 1980. Charles, 12 years her senior and under increasing pressure to settle down, noticed her in a new light, not as Sarah's kid sister, but as someone who seemed different, quiet, innocent, safe even. It wasn't long before he invited her to a weekend at Balmoral Castle, the royal family's private retreat in Scotland. At Balmoral, Diana charmed everyone. The Queen, Prince Philip, Charles, they all seemed to approve, and in royal circles, approval is everything. It didn't hurt that Diana ticked all the right boxes. Aristocratic background, check. Graceful and dutiful, check. Young and untainted by scandal, check. Whatever doubts Charles might have had about whether he truly loved her were drowned out by the collective agreement that she was perfect princess material. For Diana, it must have been overwhelming. 1 minute, she was a kindergarten assistant, and the next, she was walking the grounds of Balmoral as the likely future Queen of England. The public didn't know her yet, but that would soon change. The engagement announcement came in February 1981, accompanied by a now famous photograph of Charles and Diana sitting together. He looked reserved, as he often did. She looked radiant, though if you look closely, there's something guarded in her expression, like she was already beginning to feel the weight of what was expected of her. And then, there was the moment, the iconic interview, a moment that was supposed to cement their fairy tale in the eyes of the world. Dressed in a cobalt blue suit, which would become one of her most memorable looks, Diana sat beside Charles as the press hammered them with questions. She answered shyly, occasionally glancing at Charles for reassurance. And then a reporter asked the question, "Are you in love?" Diana responded quickly, with an innocent smile. Of course. Charles, though, added something that would ring in her ears for years, whatever in love means. Such a small phrase, yet it says so much. Diana laughed nervously in the moment, but you can't help thinking she must have wondered what he meant by that. The public shrugged it off as dry British humour, but in hindsight, it was a crack in the illusion, a hint that their engagement wasn't quite the fairy tale it seemed. Diana later revealed in interviews of her own that this was the first time she started to feel uneasy about her marriage. There were moments when Charles seemed distant, distracted, not fully present. It wasn't something she could quite put her finger on, but it gnawed at her all the same. Everyone, though, was too busy falling in love with her to notice. Diana was magnetic, even if she didn't fully understand her own power yet. She was young, beautiful, and relatable in a way that no royal had been before. People saw something of themselves in her, a mix of elegance and vulnerability. She seemed approachable, almost impossible not to root for. Crowds would gather wherever she went, people jostling just to catch a glimpse of her. What nobody realized at the time was how unprepared she was for the attention. Diana wasn't trained for this level of scrutiny, and it showed. Her shyness, which the public found endearing, often masked her discomfort. But it wasn't just the constant cameras or the pressure to present herself perfectly that weighed on her. Behind the scenes, there was another, more personal tension brewing. Charles's affection for Camilla Parker Bowles was no secret to those in the royal inner circle. And even though Diana later said she had her suspicions before the wedding, The full reality hadn't quite hit her yet. Charles didn't talk about it, and no one in the royal family thought it was necessary to spell things out for her. She may have been the future Princess of Wales, but in many ways, she was also just a teenager being thrust into a world she couldn't fully understand. Still, Diana did what she thought she needed to do. She put her head down and focused on the role she was meant to play. She posed for photographs, attended royal events, and smiled through it all, even when she felt like an outsider. Remember, she wasn't yet 20 when all of this was happening. Her life had completely transformed almost overnight. Gone were the carefree days of flat sharing with friends and laughing over bad takeout. Suddenly, there were rules: when to speak, how to wave, how to dress. Every single detail of her life was under scrutiny. And though she wore it well, the cracks were already beginning to show. By July 1981, the world had fully embraced Diana mania. Over 750 million people tuned in to watch her wedding, making it one of the most viewed events in television history. The scene was, in a word, majestic. Diana arrived at St. Paul's Cathedral in a horse-drawn carriage, her wedding dress spilling out behind her in a cloud of ivory silk and lace, its 25-foot train trailing down the aisle like something out of a movie. When she stepped out, the crowd erupted. She was a vision, every bit the princess people dreamed of. But beneath the spectacle, Diana was feeling something entirely different. She would later admit that the wedding day had been tinged with doubt. In the days leading up to it, she'd confronted Charles about his relationship with Camilla, expressing her fears and insecurities. His reassurances, she later said, felt half-hearted. In Diana's mind, this wasn't how it was supposed to feel, but she went through with it anyway. She was too far into it at that point. There were expectations, obligations, and, of course, the entire world watching. When Charles and Diana exchanged vows, the cheers were deafening. But those cheers were for a story people wanted to believe, not the reality unfolding behind the scenes. For Diana, that moment should have been the start of a dream. Instead, it marked the beginning of a life she was increasingly unsure she could handle. The public saw her as the picture of happiness, their new princess who had everything. But inside, Diana felt deeply out of place. She was playing a role, and playing it well, but she knew the love and understanding she craved wouldn't come from Charles, nor from the monarchy. If anything, their dynamic seemed to grow colder with each passing day. Diana wasn't naive. She knew something wasn't right. Looking back, you can't help but wonder if Diana really understood what she was stepping into. At 19, how could she? The institution of the monarchy is a rigid one, and the person she thought she could lean on, her husband, was emotionally unreachable from the start. It wasn't just a marriage she was navigating. It was an entire system with its own traditions, rules, and expectations, none of which cared much for her feelings. The fairy tale everyone celebrated was, for Diana, already starting to feel like a gilded cage. What the public didn't see was her growing unease, the moments of doubt that plagued her behind closed doors. Already, Diana was learning how to smile for the cameras while feeling completely lost inside. It's a skill she would hone to perfection in the years to come, becoming a master at giving people what they wanted to see, even as she wrestled silently with her own pain. But if the engagement and wedding were a whirlwind, they were nothing compared to what came next. Life as a royal wasn't just lonely, it was suffocating. Diana was about to find out just how heavy a crown could be, Life as a princess might sound dreamy, ballrooms, tiaras, and the admiration of millions. But for Diana, the reality inside palace walls couldn't have been further from the fairy tales. It began the moment she stepped into her royal role. The cameras had barely packed up after her wedding, the church bells still echoing in people's minds when the weight of her new world started pressing down on her. There were rules for everything: what to wear, what to say, even how to stand. Suddenly, this 20-year-old was expected to slot neatly into a centuries-old institution that had no time or space for individuality. Take royal protocols, for example. Imagine being told exactly how to curtsy, who to curtsy to, the precise moment to curtsy, and then realizing these aren't just casual suggestions, but mandatory rules. Diana had to learn every minute detail of palace traditions, right down to the order in which people sat at a table and how to address them. Breaking any of these rules would make headlines, and every move she made outside the palace was documented, analyzed, and judged. If she smiled too much, she was seen as frivolous. If she didn't smile enough, she was ungrateful. Diana confided in friends that she felt like she was being sized up every day, like a piece of jewelry being examined for flaws. And then there was her relationship with Charles. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple, walking side by side at grand events, attending lavish galas, exchanging small smiles for the cameras. But things at home told a different story. Charles was distant, more comfortable pursuing his hobbies, or spending time with people Diana often felt excluded from. He had a reserved coldness that Diana struggled to break through, and when she did try to talk to him about her fears or anxieties, the conversations rarely ended well. Diana was emotional, vulnerable. Charles, by contrast, had been raised in a system that taught him to push feelings aside and get on with it. Their communication styles were less a mismatch and more like two entirely different languages. The royal family only added to her sense of isolation. For them, Diana wasn't a person so much as a piece on the chessboard, strategically placed to modernize their image and provide heirs to the throne. They had little interest in her as an individual. Diana, who craved warmth and connection, was met with formality and distance at every turn. Even her relationship with the Queen, while civil, wasn't particularly warm. The monarchy has always been a family bound more by duty than affection, and Diana learned this early on. Small talk at dinner or polite nods in hallways were no replacement for the sense of belonging she needed. And this wasn't just loneliness, it was loneliness magnified by pressure. As the new Princess of Wales, Diana was being expected to fulfill a role with almost no room for error. She was in her early 20s, a time when most people are still figuring out who they are. But here she was, the most photographed woman in the world. Every hairstyle was on trial. Every dress was dissected on magazine covers. And let's not even start on the rumors. Tabloids were ruthless, spinning every glance, every turn of her head into a new headline. The very same press that adored her in public delighted in tearing her apart whenever she made the slightest misstep. Despite this, there were moments early on when Diana tried to embrace her role. When she visited hospitals or charity events, especially those involving children, her real self seemed to emerge, kind, compassionate, eager to connect with people on a human level. Those moments lit something inside her, a reminder that she wasn't just there to smile and wave. She could actually make a difference in people's lives, even if her own felt like it was slipping further out of control. But in private, Diana was struggling. She was besieged by self-doubt. feeling as though she wasn't living up to expectations. Attending glittering state dinners or massive public engagements, she often felt like a prop, not a person. The royal family seemed to thrive on ceremony, while she longed for spontaneity and genuine connection. Even her smallest desires, whether it was music or laughter, or just a moment of reprieve, seemed crushed under the weight of how things ought to be. She once described herself as a prisoner in her own home. And it wasn't just emotional hyperbole. There were physical barriers as well, security, staff, and traditions that dictated every move she made. These feelings of isolation only deepened as her marriage grew more strained. Rumors about Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles reached Diana's ears early on, turning whispers of doubt into something sharper. She wasn't naive. Diana knew that whatever bond she might have hoped for with her husband, it was fractured, and not just because of Camilla. Charles struggled to connect with her emotionally, perhaps because he'd never been taught how to express his own emotions. Diana, meanwhile, was starved for the closeness and warmth she'd lacked growing up. Their fights grew louder, their silences colder. Diana confided in those closest to her that she often felt invisible. Important to the world, maybe, but invisible to the one person whose attention she truly wanted. And yet, she was expected to show up day after day, smiling alongside a husband who barely seemed to look at her. If you revisit some of their public appearances during those early years, the awkwardness is almost painful. Charles often stood slightly apart from her, while Diana, so eager to connect, would lock eyes with strangers in a crowd, hoping to find warmth there that she couldn't find at home. There's a famous photo from one of their tours abroad, where Charles is speaking to dignitaries in the background, poised and formal, while Diana crouches in the foreground, laughing with a small child. It almost perfectly captures the difference between them. For Charles, the royal role was about duty. For Diana, it was always about humanity. The emotional neglect she experienced began to have profound effects on her. Diana felt like she was losing herself in the role she was supposed to play. Wife, princess, future queen. Compounding this was a growing sense that no matter what she did, she would never be good enough, never truly fit within the royal family. They valued tradition and stoicism. She valued openness and heart. The clash was unavoidable. As her struggles became apparent, Diana began developing coping mechanisms. Some were subtle, like retreating into herself, spending long hours alone in her rooms or seeking solace in music. Others were more damaging. By this point, the pressure, her failing marriage, and the scrutiny were manifesting in ways that even she didn't fully understand at first. Diana herself would later admit that she began self-harming, not as a way to gain attention, but because it was one of the few ways she could deal with the overwhelming feelings she couldn't express. She was also beginning to battle bulimia, though at the time, few outside her inner circle were aware of it. From the outside, Diana remained a picture of grace, beauty, and charm. But inside, she was grappling with feelings of worthlessness. Bulimia became her way of taking control in a world where everything felt dictated to her. The act of binging and purging was, in her words, a cry for help, though it remained a secret for years. And this is where Diana's isolation becomes even more heartbreaking. Rather than acknowledging her pain, many within the royal family dismissed it. They saw her struggles as a nuisance, something that should have been brushed under the rug. Diana felt deeply misunderstood, both as a wife and as a woman. Even those who cared for her didn't seem to know how to offer support. This left Diana to fight her battles alone. A girl who just a few years earlier had been too shy to even look people in the eye, was now expected to maintain composure under an unbearable spotlight. By now, what had once felt like a fairy tale had become a gilded cage. Diana had longed for a sense of belonging, but instead, she found herself trapped in a life that left no room for her true self. It's not hard to see how this pattern, the abandonment she'd felt as a child, the need for love, the repeated rejection, might have left her spiraling. And though she poured herself into her charity work and found solace in acts of kindness, there was still a piece of her that felt unsteady. She wasn't the perfect princess. She wasn't the perfect wife. And the fear of never being enough slowly unraveled her in ways that became harder and harder to conceal. But Diana was nothing if not resilient. And even in the darkest seasons of her life, she was beginning to figure out how to hold on to herself, how to survive, even when it felt impossible. And survival meant finding ways to reclaim control, even in the smallest, quietest acts. As her struggles became more visible, so too did her strength, though that strength came at a price. For Diana, the dream of love had led to despair, and her life as a royal was no fairy tale. It was a cage, one she was just beginning to figure out how to escape. Imagine sharing your life with someone, thinking they're your partner in every sense of the word, only to find out their heart belongs to someone else. That was Diana's reality, and it wasn't a quiet revelation. The cracks in her marriage weren't gradual lines that grew over time. They were jagged fractures from the very start. From the outside, Diana and Charles seemed to have everything: titles, palaces, 2 young sons, and a place in history. But behind the glitz and choreographed public appearances, things were unraveling faster than Diana could hold them together. Diana's suspicions about Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles didn't begin in a vacuum. Even before their wedding, there were signs. Camilla wasn't just lingering in the background of Charles's life. She was always there, whether Diana wanted to acknowledge it or not. At one point, Diana reportedly discovered that Charles had ordered a custom bracelet with the letters G and F engraved on it, standing for Gladys and Fred, the nicknames he and Camilla used for each other. She tried to confront him, desperate for reassurance, but the answers never soothed her fears. The early years of their marriage were a constant tug-of-war between what was expected and what Diana was actually experiencing. Charles often appeared detached, leaving Diana to navigate royal life largely on her own. The gap between them grew wider with every forced smile, every formal event where they stood side by side but felt miles apart. Diana later admitted there were moments of public appearances where she'd wave to crowds, turn slightly, and catch Charles shooting her a glance filled with irritation or disinterest. These small, daily reminders of their emotional disconnect chipped away at her self-esteem. And then came the undeniable discovery, the moment when the suspicions about Camilla weren't just in her mind anymore. Diana found evidence of the affair, both small and glaringly obvious. There was the bracelet, yes, but also phone calls, quiet mentions of Camilla's name, and the way he always seemed just slightly more at ease when she was around. Diana once famously said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." That wasn't exaggeration. To her, it was a devastating truth. Everything she had worked so hard to believe in, the love she'd hoped to share, the family she wanted to create, came crashing down under the weight of that third presence. The betrayal hit Diana hard. She wasn't just hurt, she was deeply humiliated. The world saw her as the beautiful young princess who had stolen the nation's heart. But inside, she felt small and inadequate. She began questioning if it was something about her. Was she not enough? Was she not interesting enough? Not beautiful enough? Those questions spiraled into what Diana described as a cycle of self-doubt and self-punishment. Her struggles with bulimia took root during this time, something we'll talk about more later, but it's important to understand how intertwined it was with the emotional turmoil of her marriage. Food became one of the few things Diana could control when everything else in her world seemed chaotic and uncertain. And all the while, the royal family barely seemed to notice or care. Diana once tried to bring her concerns to them, hoping for guidance or some kind of support. She wanted answers. How was she supposed to navigate a marriage where her husband's heart belonged elsewhere? But instead of receiving sympathy, she was met with indifference. The royal family, known for their stiff upper lip and tendency to avoid emotional discussions, saw her struggles as inconvenient, even overly dramatic. To them, the duty of being a royal came first. Emotions, those could be swept neatly under the rug. If anything, Diana felt even more isolated after seeking help. The message she received, loud and clear, was that she was meant to endure this silently. She was a princess now, and princesses didn't show pain. They smiled for cameras, switched perfectly from handshakes to waves, and didn't let personal problems interfere with state dinners. In public, Diana kept this up with remarkable grace. But behind closed doors, she was crumbling. The tension between Diana and Charles didn't stay behind the palace walls, though. Over time, the cracks began to show, even on camera. There were public appearances where the two barely spoke, and a few where they openly argued. Their 1983 tour of Australia is one example. On the surface, it was a success. Crowds gathered in massive numbers to see Diana, and she seemed to win over the hearts of the Australian people. But inside the royal bubble, significant tension was brewing. Charles couldn't hide his jealousy over Diana's immense popularity. He was the heir to the throne, but in every city they visited, all eyes were on her. That resentment spilled over into their private moments, creating even more distance between them. There were other moments too that highlighted the growing divide between them. Photos from royal events often showed Diana sitting slightly apart from Charles, her shoulders tilted away, her gaze elsewhere. In one particularly telling instance, Diana refused to adhere to protocol during a Canadian tour in 1991. When Charles attempted to kiss her for the cameras, she pulled away, laughing nervously but making no move to let him follow through. The press caught it immediately, and while most chalked it up to nerves, others started questioning the state of their marriage. But the moments that truly gutted Diana weren't the public clashes. They were the private humiliations. The dinners where Charles barely spoke a word to her. The nights when he left her alone, often retreating to the comfort of his thoughts. Or Camilla. Diana felt trapped, and not just in the marriage. The royal institution itself made her feel powerless. Every choice she tried to make was filtered, approved, or told no. Every opportunity to step away from the pain of her personal life ran up against the cold rigidity of what was expected of her. Diana wasn't just hurt by Charles's actions or his ongoing relationship with Camilla. She was hurt by the sense that, in the grander scheme of things, almost no one seemed to care about the woman beneath the title. Her pain was secondary to the monarchy's image. Her feelings? Merely distractions from the primary goal of keeping up appearances. Even as she tried to stand on her own amid the collapse of her marriage, she faced a press machine that cheered for her downfall. Tabloid headlines painted her as erratic, overly emotional, even unstable. Privately, Diana felt she was being pushed further into a corner, losing control of her life piece by piece. But if there's something true about Diana, it's that even under immense pressure, her survival instincts kicked in. The pain, the betrayal, the loneliness, it did something to her. It pushed her to take risks, to stop playing by the rules she'd come to quietly resent. The interviews she did, the way she began speaking more openly about her struggles, these were Diana's way of pulling some power back into her own hands. She started to realize that the royal family might have expected her to remain silent, but the public would listen when she spoke. In her most vulnerable moments, she discovered the strength to show the world her truth. And yet, those bold public moves didn't erase the pain of what was happening in private. Diana's marriage, the one the world had once celebrated with such hope, became a source of deep personal suffering. For years she'd tried to make it work, to fulfill her duties, to be the perfect royal wife. But perfection wasn't what the world saw, and it wasn't what Charles wanted. At every turn, it seemed she was fighting battles she couldn't win. Not with him, not with the royal family, and not with the image the world had created for her. By the late 1980s, the marriage had effectively fallen apart. The love stories splashed across magazine covers had been swapped for scandalous tell-alls and tabloid leaks. Each move Charles and Diana made seemed to deepen the chasm between them. They were still bound by titles and appearances, but the reality was impossible to ignore. For Diana, what was once a dream had turned into a painful illusion, one marked by betrayal and disconnection. The fairy tale wasn't just over. It had become something she wanted to escape at any cost. What happens when a person feels like they're fading in a life they never imagined for themselves? For Diana, that struggle for identity would take center stage. And as the cracks in her marriage deepened, so did her need to reclaim control over her life, her health, and the image the world had decided for her. But first came the hardest part, confronting her reflection and finding ways to fight back, even when it felt impossible. For Diana, food wasn't just food. It wasn't just a meal or a snack, something to enjoy and then forget about. It became a constant source of comfort, but also, strangely, a battleground. In her world, where she had very little control, food was the one thing she could manage on her own terms. And what began as an emotional reaction soon turned into a destructive coping mechanism, one that mirrored the chaos she felt inside. Diana herself once said that her battle with bulimia started around the time her marriage began falling apart. It wasn't hard to see why. The fracture lines in her relationship with Charles, combined with the relentless demands of royal life, left Diana feeling like no part of her life truly belonged to her. She felt undervalued, unlovable, and deeply rejected, not just by her husband, but by the institution she'd thrown herself into. It wasn't one thing that triggered it. It was everything. The pressure to embody perfection as the Princess of Wales was suffocating. Everyone expected her to be flawless, and at first, she tried so hard to meet those expectations. But when that perfection started to feel impossible, her frustration and insecurities began to manifest in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Bulimia gave her both relief and torment. It was a way to take control in a life that felt constantly off balance, but it also kept a vicious cycle going, a pattern where no meal was ever just a meal. Eating brought guilt, guilt brought purging, and purging brought a brief numbness that quickly dissolved into shame. This wasn't just about physical appearance, though. It wasn't about fitting into a dress or looking polished for the cameras. It was deeper than that. Diana's struggle with bulimia was emotional, rooted in the need to feel worthy, to feel seen. In her own words, it was a symptom of what was going on in her marriage. It wasn't about food at all, really. It was about pain, rejection, and loneliness. Being with someone who couldn't or wouldn't reciprocate her love left Diana feeling cold inside, and food became a way to momentarily fill that emptiness, even if just for a moment. Her episodes of binging and purging were done in secret. She would eat massive amounts of food, much more than anyone would find normal, and then purge it all afterward. It was a ritual that helped her release some of the pent-up emotions she didn't have any other outlet for. But it wasn't a solution. Like any unhealthy coping mechanism, it created more problems than it solved. She began to feel trapped, not just by the royal expectations or her deteriorating marriage, but now by her own body and the habits she was developing to survive. Mental health experts today often describe bulimia as a way of regaining control, especially for those who feel powerless in other areas of their lives. For Diana, it's clear that this was a way to process the rejection she felt from Charles and the isolation she experienced within the royal family. When the world around you doesn't listen, doesn't care, and doesn't make space for you, you start finding ways to make noise, even if it's through self-destructive behaviors. The saddest part? Almost no one noticed at first. Diana's outward appearance didn't raise any alarms. If anything, the weight loss that came with her bulimia was praised by the media, who splashed images of her radiant smile and slim figure across magazines. Headlines called her a style icon, a slender beauty. They talked about her effortlessly glamorous looks while completely ignoring the woman underneath. In a way, that mirrored how Diana felt in her daily life, celebrated for how she looked, but often dismissed for who she was. Diana tried to tell the people around her how much she was struggling, but her pleas were met with dismissiveness. The royal family didn't want to deal with her complexity. They chalked it up to emotional instability, trivial complaints, maybe even a bit of youthful immaturity. It only served to isolate her further. Diana had no way of knowing it then, but her struggles were heartbreakingly similar to those of millions of women around the world. Women who also battled eating disorders in silence, feeling too ashamed or too misunderstood to ask for help. Years later, when Diana did speak openly about her bulimia, it struck a chord with people in a way she may not have expected. "You inflict it upon yourself," she said in an interview, "because your self-esteem is at a low ebb, and you don't think you're worthy or valuable." For so many who heard those words, they weren't a confession, they were a mirror. Diana's vulnerability suddenly made her more relatable, more human. The glamour and polished exterior didn't disappear, but for the first time, people saw the hurt behind it. And while Diana's openness didn't solve her struggle overnight, it marked a turning point. By stepping into the light and acknowledging her pain, she was, in a way, reclaiming agency over her narrative. It didn't erase the years of damage she'd done to her body, but it gave her a voice in a world that had silenced her for so long. That honesty and vulnerability became one of the most powerful aspects of her legacy. What mental health professionals often underline is that eating disorders, like bulimia, feed off secrecy. The shame they create keeps the cycle going, making it nearly impossible to heal unless light is shed on the behaviors and feelings beneath them. For Diana, speaking publicly about her fight was an essential first step, even though the media initially sensationalized it. Some commentators seemed more interested in exploiting her struggle rather than understanding it, but the ordinary people following her story felt something different. They saw themselves in her. They saw someone who was hurting, someone who was surviving in spite of it all. And Diana's openness about this subject didn't just stop at herself. As she began to focus more on her humanitarian efforts, she extended that empathy toward others, whether it was in hospitals, shelters, or support centers. Diana's genuine interest in people's pain often came from a deeply personal place. She understood loneliness, she understood shame, and she understood what it felt like to carry a burden so heavy it seemed impossible to set down. Her ability to connect with people on this level, to make them feel seen and heard, is something that would define her in ways few royals ever have achieved. By turning her private pain into a public truth, Diana chipped away at the stigma surrounding mental health, particularly for women. In the 1980s and 1990s, conversations about eating disorders were rare and often buried under layers of shame and misunderstanding. But Diana helped shift that narrative, even if she didn't realize it at the time. Her willingness to say, "This is what I went through," inspired others to do the same, to seek help, to open up, to be honest about their own struggles. In hindsight, Diana's battle with bulimia was never about weakness. It was about survival. It was her way of channeling the chaos she couldn't control, of trying to find balance in a life that gave her so little stability. And though it hurt her deeply, physically and emotionally, it was also a cry for help, a way of saying, "I'm still here, even if no one can see me." Looking back at this chapter of her life, it almost feels like a quiet rebellion. In a world where she was expected to be perfect, Diana's bulimia was her imperfect, messy way of coping. It didn't bring her peace, not entirely, but it was a step in a journey that eventually led her to find new strength, a strength she would later channel into kindness and compassion, not just for herself, but for everyone she encountered. As Diana began to shift her focus toward making a difference in the world, you can imagine that some of the strength she poured into others came from lessons she'd learned in these darker times. She knew what it felt like to drown, and she used that knowledge to help others stay afloat. And of course, this was only the beginning of her transformation. From a woman shackled by pain into the people's princess the world would come to know and love. But for Diana, healing wasn't linear. It was messy, complicated, and ongoing, just like anyone else's. And that, perhaps, was her quiet superpower, reminding everyone that even amidst suffering, there's always the possibility of finding something bigger to hold on to. Diana's personal life may have been crumbling, but in the public eye, she was blossoming into something far greater than anyone could have expected. A princess with purpose, and later, a global symbol of humanity. Somehow, amidst her own struggles, she started finding her voice, not in speeches or grand declarations, but in powerful, understated actions that left a mark on everyone who saw them. And here's where Diana broke the mold. She realized that her position wasn't just about duty or status. It could be a platform, a way to focus the world's attention on causes and people who had long been ignored. One of the moments that cemented her title as the People's Princess happened in 1987, when Diana visited a hospital in London and shook hands with an AIDS patient. At that time, the world was gripped with fear and paranoia about the disease, and AIDS patients were often stigmatized, even avoided completely out of ignorance. The image of her sitting calmly with the patient, no gloves, no hesitation, said more than any speech could. That handshake was a statement. It showed empathy, understanding, and, more than anything else, a refusal to buy into the fear-mongering. The photo of that moment went around the world, bringing a new level of awareness to an illness that so many people misunderstood. It's easy to forget how groundbreaking that was. At the time, even touching an AIDS patient was seen by some as dangerous. Yet here was Diana, quietly dismantling those stigmas with one small action. But her compassion wasn't limited to medical causes. Landmines might seem like the kind of topic only governments care about, but Diana brought it into the realm of everyday conversation. In 1997, during a trip to Angola with the Halo Trust, she walked through a cleared minefield in a protective vest and visor, highlighting the way leftover mines in post-conflict regions continue to harm civilians. It sounds like such an obvious issue to care about. Who wouldn't want to clear deadly mines from villages, right? But the truth was, those kinds of ongoing dangers were often ignored. Diana's visit, and those iconic photos of her in Angola, made it impossible for people to look away. She quite literally walked into danger to highlight the suffering of others. And it wasn't just a symbolic gesture. Her advocacy pushed landmine clearance efforts into global consciousness and even played a part in inspiring the Ottawa Treaty, which sought to ban anti-personnel mines. What made Diana's humanitarian work so powerful wasn't just the causes she took on. It was the way she connected with people. We often talk about relatable public figures, but Diana took that to an entirely different level. When she walked into a hospital room or a shelter, there wasn't a feeling of distance or obligation. She didn't just show up, pose for a few photos and leave. She listened. She sat down on the floor with children. She leaned in close while patients spoke. For people who felt overlooked or discarded, Diana gave them something they rarely got, a sense of dignity. She made them feel seen. This level of connection wasn't what people expected from a royal. Royals were supposed to shake hands and cut ribbons, stand on balconies and wave distantly toward the crowd below. Diana didn't just wave. She climbed down into the crowd, and in doing so, she shook up an institution that prided itself on its untouchable image. Her compassion became a quiet rebellion against the coldness she encountered within palace walls. If the royal family valued tradition over emotion, Diana chose to value people over tradition. Of course, this came at a cost. Her growing popularity wasn't just a problem for Charles, who by now was clearly resentful of the way Diana overshadowed him in almost every public engagement. It was also an issue for the rest of the royal family. Quietly, behind the scenes, there was discomfort, maybe even irritation, at the way Diana seemed to be challenging the monarchy's carefully curated image. Royals weren't supposed to cry publicly or share their pain in interviews. They weren't supposed to sit cross-legged with children or shake hands with the sick. Diana, in her own way, was rewriting what it meant to be royal, and some didn't appreciate that. Her humanitarian efforts, while celebrated by millions, also made her a target for criticism. Some saw her as self-serving, suggesting that she used her charity work to distract from the scandals brewing in her personal life. Others accused her of being too outspoken or too emotional, two traits that didn't sit well with certain members of the establishment. But criticism didn't seem to stop her. If anything, it gave her more reason to push forward. And it wasn't that Diana didn't understand what it cost her to stand apart. She knew. Deep down, she was fully aware of the consequences of being more emotionally open, more honest, more human, something the monarchy seemed determined to avoid. But Diana had always been guided by something outside the rules of her position. Kindness, connection. Those things mattered to her far more than following protocols or keeping up appearances. Look back at some of the most famous images of Diana during this time. Cradling a child in her lap at an orphanage, walking through an Anglian minefield, sitting knee to knee with a sick patient at a hospital. The power in those moments didn't come from what she said, but simply in how present she was. She didn't need speeches or grand gestures to make people feel cared for. It was the small, quiet moments that turned her into a symbol of hope for so many. But her growing independence, her ability to make her own voice heard and her story matter, inevitably led to more tension with the royal family. Diana's willingness to connect with people personally flew in the face of the monarchy's distant, institutional approach. When she started speaking more candidly about her personal struggles, the rift between her and the royal family only deepened. Her work with charities became more than just a mission. It became a way to carve out her identity in a world that had spent years trying to erase it. Still, wherever Diana went, she left an impression. Not just on the people she helped, but on the people watching her. On the surface, sure, she was still Princess Diana, the glamorous royal with a wardrobe that sparked trends and inspired everything from hairstyles to handbags. But what made her unforgettable wasn't her elegance, it was her heart. For the first time, the world saw a royal who acted less like someone above them and more like someone beside them. Of course, even as Diana became a figure of hope, her vulnerability made her a lightning rod for both love and criticism. The tabloids, never far from her shadow, frequently capitalized on any misstep or perceived weakness. But Diana's raw honesty about her pain, her struggles with bulimia, her broken marriage, her feeling of isolation within the palace, turned her into something the public longed for, a real person. And that magnetism, that ability to make herself relatable in spite of her privilege, was perhaps her greatest strength. At the heart of it, Diana's humanitarian efforts weren't just acts of compassion. They were acts of defiance against a life that had tried to shrink her down into something it could control. By stepping into the world and using her platform to elevate others, Diana reclaimed herself piece by piece. She may not have been able to change the royal family, nor escape the relentless glare of the media, but she could still make an enormous difference in people's lives, and she did. By the late 90s, Diana wasn't just the Princess of Wales. She was a figure who had outgrown royal titles entirely. To her admirers, she was simply the people's princess. And while the royal family may have been uneasy with that image, Diana embraced it. Her willingness to show her imperfections, to share her compassion, and to connect with people who had been overlooked made her into something bigger than any crown. It made her a symbol. But as with everything in her life, this new image came with its own complications. The more independent Diana became, both as a public figure and as a person, the more that independence clashed with the traditions of the institution she'd married into. And in 1995, with a single explosive interview, Diana would do the unthinkable. She would expose those cracks to the world, leaving the monarchy and her own life forever changed. In 1995, the world stopped to watch as Diana, Princess of Wales, did something no royal had dared to do before. She sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for a tell-all television interview broadcast on BBC's Panorama. For 54 minutes, in an unassuming grey suite and with her trademark shy smile, she unravelled the tightly controlled image the monarchy had worked so hard to preserve. But this wasn't just a casual conversation or an overreaching tabloid scoop. It was a calculated risk, one that would send shockwaves through the royal family, captivate millions of viewers, and transform Diana's role in the public imagination forever. To understand the weight of this moment, you need to picture everything at play in Diana's life right then. Her marriage to Prince Charles was already publicly on the rocks. Tabloid stories about their disagreements, affairs, and crumbling relationship had swirled for years, and whispers of the royal family's disapproval of Diana had grown louder. By this point, she was separated from Charles, living on her own with her two sons, William and Harry. Officially, she still held her title and her place within the monarchy, but privately, she was carving out her independence after years of feeling silenced. And more than anything, she seemed ready, finally, to take control of her story. What made the Panorama interview so electrifying, though, wasn't the build-up. It was Diana's willingness to expose her vulnerabilities on a level no one had ever seen before. Sitting across from Bashir, she spoke in quiet but sharp honesty, leaving nothing ambiguous about the things that had gone wrong. There was a certain restraint in her delivery, but that only magnified the impact of her words. Her now infamous quote summed it all up. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. With one sentence, Diana all but confirmed the worst-kept secret about Charles's ongoing affair with Camilla Parker Bowles, pulling back the curtain on what her life had really been like as the wife of the future king. But it wasn't just her marriage she laid bare. Diana also spoke openly about her struggles with mental health, admitting to a battle with bulimia that had consumed much of her life behind closed doors. It was a symptom of what was going on in my marriage, she explained, her voice calm, yet tinged with a sadness that was hard to miss. And in doing so, she cracked open a conversation about eating disorders and mental health in ways that hadn't truly existed before, particularly not among the rich, famous, or untouchable. Of course, not everything she revealed in the interview was about personal pain. Diana used it as an opportunity to question the system she had been a part of since the age of 20. "I don't think many people will want to be king," she said, referring to the crushing pressure and scrutiny of royal life. Then there was her admission of infidelity, her relationship with James Hewitt, which further exposed just how broken and fractured her marriage had been. And though the tone wasn't accusatory or bitter, she didn't shy away from questioning whether the royal family had ever really supported or understood her. The risk Diana took in sharing her perspective were enormous. It's one thing to speak out against an institution. It's another to speak out against the monarchy, Britain's oldest and most revered symbol of stability. Through centuries of tradition, the family had maintained an unspoken rule. No matter what happens behind closed doors, you don't air your struggles. You don't reveal cracks. Diana shattered that rule, and she didn't just hint at cracks, she put them on full display. For a royal family as obsessed with control and image as the Windsors, this was nothing short of rebellion. Unsurprisingly, the backlash was immediate. The royal family was furious, not just with what Diana had said, but with the sheer audacity of saying it at all. This was a woman who was still technically a royal, despite her separation, yet she had gone on national television to share secrets that undercut the very foundation of what the monarchy stood for. Behind the scenes, tensions reached a boiling point. Diana was positioning herself not as a member of the establishment, but as an outsider, a truth teller speaking directly to the millions of people who had grown tired of the perfect, polished royal facade. And the media, well, the reactions were complicated. Publicly, many newspapers ate up the story, plastering Diana's quotes on their front pages and labeling her both courageous and reckless, depending on the editorial slant. Privately, though, it was clear Panorama was a ratings juggernaut. Over 20 million people tuned in, making it one of the most watched interviews in British history. It didn't just dominate headlines in the UK. The effects rippled globally. Diana's candor turned her into an even bigger figure than she had been before, which, in itself, caused a different kind of strain. Because here's the thing, once you expose the truth, you can't take it back. Diana's interview deepened the rift between her and the Windsors. It also invited the world further into her private life, a life she had spent years trying to reclaim from the relentless grip of the press. Some even speculated at the time that this was part of Diana's strategy, that by speaking her truth, she wasn't just challenging the royals, she was making herself untouchable in the eyes of the public. And to an extent, it worked. The public adored her even more after the interview. Her honesty, her willingness to acknowledge her faults, her refusal to stay silent, it all made her feel deeply human in a way no royal ever had been before. Still, the fallout from the interview was impossible to ignore. For the monarchy, it created a sense of urgency to formally sever ties with Diana. Just months later, in August 1996, her divorce from Charles was finalized, and with it came the stripping of her title, Her Royal Highness. Diana would now simply be Diana, Princess of Wales, a subtle but significant demotion that sent a clear message about where she now stood in the royal hierarchy. For someone who had spent so much of her life bound to royal expectations, this formal separation was both a loss and a liberation. But what about Diana herself? What did the interview mean for her personally? On one level, it was undoubtedly cathartic, a way of releasing years of pain and frustration that had built up in silence. On another level, it was risky. Diana's vulnerabilities had made her relatable, but they also made her a target. In the months after Panorama, the press became even more relentless, dissecting her every move with even greater intensity. And as her marriage officially ended, Diana faced the almost impossible task of redefining herself outside of the royal family, a role she was still struggling to fully ease into. It's no wonder, then, that Diana found herself seeking something like peace in the years that followed. Her actions had made her a champion of the people, especially for those who felt silenced in their own lives. But at what cost? The interview had heightened her profile while deepening her estrangement from the only institution that had given her power in the first place. And though she carried herself with remarkable grace in the aftermath, those who knew her best have said these years were marked by an ongoing tension, a constant push and pull between reclaiming her independence and dealing with the attention that independence had brought her. Looking back now, it's clear why the Panorama interview remains such a defining moment in Diana's story. It wasn't just a media event or a royal scandal. It was Diana fighting to be seen, to be heard. After years of enduring a life shaped by other people's expectations, she finally claimed her narrative. And in doing so, she showed the world that even someone as seemingly untouchable as a princess could wrestle with loneliness, betrayal, and the search for freedom. But freedom is rarely simple. As much as Diana's honesty won her admiration and sympathy, it also left her more exposed than ever before. Her story had finally been told, but the fallout was far from over. With the royal chapter of her life ending, she was about to embark on the next phase, one defined not by palaces, titles, or even duty, but by a quiet search for happiness. And as she stepped away from the monarchy that had defined much of her adult life, Diana found herself chasing something she'd spent years longing for: love, and maybe even a chance to live on her own terms. In the summer of 1997, Diana seemed different. If you'd followed her story closely up until this point, you might have noticed a quiet shift. A woman who had spent years under the weight of scrutiny and pain, tied to a life that demanded appearances over authenticity, now gave off the slightest hint that she was searching for something smaller, calmer, somewhere she could finally just be Diana, not the Princess of Wales, not the front page of every tabloid in the world. For a moment, it looked like she might have found it. Diana met Dodi Al-Fayed through a connection she already knew well. His father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, the billionaire owner of Harrods. Mohammed had invited Diana and her sons, William and Harry, to spend time aboard his luxury yacht in the Mediterranean that summer. It wasn't unusual for Diana to borrow moments like these to escape the constant wave of press waiting for her every move back home. The summer sun on the turquoise waters of the Mediterranean provided the perfect backdrop for the privacy she longed for. A small slice of freedom out of reach of helicopter lenses and zoom cameras. But this trip was different for another reason. This time, she wasn't just escaping. She wasn't even alone. It's hard to say exactly when her connection with Dodi began to deepen. They'd run in similar circles for years, but their lives couldn't have been more different. Dodi, a film producer and businessman, had a reputation for living lavishly, with an effortless charm that seemed a world away from the rigid constraints Diana had grown used to. Together, they were spotted on his father's yacht, soaking up the sun in what looked like pure contentment. The images that did surface showed them laughing, smiling, even embracing. Diana looking carefree, in a way that felt almost startling compared to the reserve she'd always displayed in her public life. For Diana, who had been through the exhaustion of a public separation, a bitter divorce, and the endless carousel of headlines, the relationship with Dodi looked like a refreshing new chapter. If nothing else, he seemed to offer her a kind of unapologetic attention, an admiration that had been absent from her love life for years. Some of her closest confidants speculated that while she wasn't sure where their relationship was heading, she saw this period of her life as a needed reset, an interlude where she could finally breathe. Privacy, after all, had become her most valuable currency. And yet, as always, the world refused to leave her alone. Paparazzi swarmed any location they suspected Diana and Dodi might visit. On some days, the frenzy seemed almost absurd. Photographers speeding behind motorboats to get the perfect angle of them on the yacht, or snapping blurry images through waves of heat on distant balconies. Shopping trips turned into media storms, their strolling interrupted by flashes from every direction. The relationship itself became a headline, with reckless speculation about Diana's intentions, Dodi's suitability, and even their future together. But the worst wasn't in print. It was the physical presence of cameras everywhere they turned. For someone so deeply scarred by the constant intrusion of the press, the relentlessness of this summer's attention must have felt like a cruel joke. The very spotlight she was trying to escape burned brighter and hotter than ever before. Still, some days seemed worth it. There were dinners in exquisite private settings, warm nights on the Mediterranean, and shared quiet moments where Diana could let her walls down. She spent time calling her sons, ensuring they were happy and safe back in Britain, and tried, despite everything, to balance this rare personal happiness with her role as a mother. Her boys remained at the center of her world, even when she was thousands of miles away. Some reports suggest that during this summer, she spoke about how proud she was of William and Harry, of how protected she tried to keep them, despite knowing the world was waiting for their every misstep, the same way it had been waiting for hers years earlier. But beneath the joy of these final weeks was a tension Diana couldn't quite shake. The pressure of the media robbed so many of her decisions of spontaneity. Every port the yacht docked in, every day trip they planned, was met with yet another crowd of photographers. And as much as they tried to elude the attention, it was impossible. Near the end of August, Diana and Dodi arrived in Paris, hoping for just one evening of peace. A quiet dinner, maybe a moment to step out of the spotlight together. But even there in the city of light, the pursuit continued. Diana was no stranger to that pressure. The unblinking eye of the media had followed her since she was just 19, documenting her every movement, whether joyful or tearful, truthful or spun into scandal. And by 1997, it had only grown worse. This was a time when the tabloid industry was at its most ruthless. There wasn't just money to be made from selling stories about Diana. There was a fortune to be made. Paparazzi were incentivized to push limits, sometimes risking their safety and hers just to get an exclusive shot. Now, with her new relationship making waves, the demand for pictures of Diana and Dodi together created what felt like a storm Diana simply couldn't outrun. Her last days in Paris were filled with fleeting moments, ones that would later be magnified as the world tried to piece together the hours before everything changed. On the night of August 30th, Diana and Dodi dined at the Ritz Hotel, a property owned by his father. Inside the walls of the luxurious hotel, they might have felt a brief sense of refuge, but outside, the chaos was waiting. Paparazzi lined the streets, cameras in hand, engines running. Escape plans were made. A quiet departure was arranged, with the hope of slipping away unnoticed. Then came the drive. It was late, nearing midnight, when Diana and Dodi left the Ritz, accompanied by their bodyguard Trevor Rhys-Jones and driver Henri Paul. The black Mercedes carrying them sped through the streets of Paris, chased by a swarm of photographers determined to capture what no one else could. The tension that had followed Diana all summer, unrelenting and impossible to shake, reached a boiling point in that car. The photographers didn't slow down. The driver didn't either. In the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, it ended. That final chase marked one of the most tragic moments the world had ever witnessed. An ending so sudden, so completely unexpected, that the grief rippled across continents. For Diana, who had spent her final weeks hoping to escape the public eye, those final moments were anything but private. The world awoke on August 31st, 1997, to the unimaginable. Phones rang with disbelief. News anchors broke into broadcasts with shaky voices. People stepped out of their houses in stunned silence, many wiping tears and leaving flowers on pavements thousands of miles from Paris. That was the effect Diana had. She wasn't just a royal figure. She was something more human, more tangible. Her vulnerability, her flaws, her kindness, they left a mark far deeper than her title ever could have. Diana's final summer, filled with fleeting joy and relentless invasion, encapsulated the paradox of her life. She was a woman who wanted simplicity but lived in one of the most complex and scrutinized roles imaginable. She longed for peace, but wherever she went, chaos followed. And even as she fought for moments of happiness, the weight of the world's gaze remained unbearable. That summer wasn't just her last. It was a snapshot of everything she had lived through, the fleeting highs, the relentless lows, and the constant battle to hold on to herself through it all. But as the days following her death unfolded, and the mourning spread like waves, something became clear. Diana's search for love and freedom might have ended tragically, but her legacy wasn't defined by loss. It was defined by the millions of people who saw her, not as a perfect princess, but as someone who had fought through pain with grace and a determination to make the world just a little kinder than she had found it. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, the streets of Paris were quiet. The kind of quiet that lingers only after midnight, when most are asleep and the city's chaos feels like it belongs to someone else. But even in those quiet hours, Diana, Princess of Wales, was not alone. She never really was. That night, she and Dodi Al-Fayed were attempting to leave the Ritz Hotel, pursued by a swarm of paparazzi hungry for another exclusive. Their quiet escape plan was anything but quiet. It wasn't unusual for Diana to plan her movements carefully. She'd spent years dodging flashing cameras and outrunning questions she didn't want to answer. But this night was different. The plan was to leave the hotel unnoticed. No grand exit, no scene. Just her and Dodi, slipping into a waiting black Mercedes S280 driven by Henri Paul, the hotel's acting security manager. A decoy vehicle was sent out first, meant to draw away lingering photographers, but it didn't work. By the time Diana and Dodi's car exited through the back, paparazzi were already tailing them. Trevor Rees-Jones, their bodyguard, sat in the front passenger seat, and the car's tires screeched as it sped off into the Paris night. The chase was relentless. On motorcycles and cars, the photographers followed at a breakneck pace, the pursuit winding through narrow streets and along the Seine. It was the kind of pursuit that had defined much of Diana's life. Cameras always closing in on her every move, her privacy reduced to whatever small corners she could clutch for herself. But this time, in the early morning haze, with Henri Paul pushing the car faster and faster, it proved to be more than just another chase. As the Mercedes approached the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, speeding at an estimated 65 miles per hour, far above the speed limit, the balance tipped. Henri Paul lost control as the car entered the tunnel, slamming into one of the concrete pillars that lined its interior. The crash was catastrophic. The crumpled Mercedes came to a halt, smoke curling into the air as the blare of sirens began in the distance. The once quiet streets of Paris were now anything but. At the scene, the devastation was all-consuming. Henri Paul and Dodi Al-Fayed were killed instantly. Trevor Rees-Jones, the bodyguard, survived, but was left with severe injuries, his face and memory shattered by the impact. Diana, sitting in the back seat on the right-hand side, was found alive by emergency responders. Barely. She was rushed to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, clinging to life in an ambulance racing against the clock. But even the desperate efforts of Paris's best surgeons couldn't change how this night would end. At 4 a.m., Diana was pronounced dead from massive internal injuries. She was just 36 years old. The world didn't understand at first. Early breaking news reports were scattered and confused, describing the crash as serious, but leaving her condition unclear. As people woke up across Europe, the gravity of the situation began to settle. By the time the news of her death was confirmed, disbelief had turned into collective heartbreak. You didn't have to be British to feel it. From London to Tokyo to Buenos Aires, there was a sudden hush, a global shared moment of shock. like the air had been knocked out of the entire planet. For those who had followed Diana's life so closely, it was almost unthinkable. A woman who had seemed larger than life, her smile and grace a constant presence in newspapers, magazine covers, and on television screens, was suddenly gone. And the question no one could ignore was, why? Why had this happened? Why had it been allowed to happen? In London, the heart of the morning was Kensington Palace, Diana's home after her separation from Prince Charles. Within hours, people began flooding the gates, laying down flowers, cards, and candles in an impromptu memorial. But what began as a slow trickle of tributes swelled into an ocean of grief in the days that followed. Mounds of flowers, stretching as far as the eye could see, began to pile up outside the gates. People left teddy bears, handwritten notes, photographs of her with her sons. Some simply stood there, in silence, not knowing what else to do. The funeral, held just 6 days later on September 6th, became one of the most watched events in history. Here's the thing about watching monumental moments like that. They don't feel real, even as they're happening. Over 2.5 billion people tuned in to see her coffin, draped in the royal standard, as it made its slow journey through the streets of London. The sound of cheers and shouts that Diana was so used to was replaced by silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of military boots echoing against the pavement. Elton John performed Candle in the Wind, its lyrics rewritten to honor Diana, a performance that left people in tears both at Westminster Abbey and in living rooms across the globe. But it wasn't just the size of the crowd or the speakers at her service that made the funeral unforgettable. It was the sight of her two sons, Princes William and Harry, walking behind the coffin alongside their father, Charles. At just 15 and 12, they faced the world in the most painful moment of their young lives, their faces stoic, their grief clear in every step. Behind them followed a handwritten note from Harry, perched above the coffin. It read simply, "Mummy." The tributes didn't stop with the funeral. Across the world, people shared their stories of Diana's impact, both personal and global. HIV/AIDS activists spoke about how she had humanized their cause by shaking hands with patients when no one else dared. Mothers talked about how she had inspired them to hold their children closer, just as she had always done with hers. And charity workers told of how Diana had used her status not for vanity, but to shed light on the people and places the world wanted to forget, whether it was landmine victims in Angola or the homeless in London. Despite her complicated relationship with the monarchy, Diana's death became a turning point for public perceptions of the royal family. For years, the institution had operated at a cold remove from the people it supposedly served, but in the days following Diana's death, that frostiness came under sharp scrutiny. People criticized the Queen and the rest of the royals for their slow response, for their apparent reluctance to engage with the outpouring of grief happening in the streets of London. The public demanded something the monarchy wasn't used to giving: emotion. Eventually, the pressure forced them into action. The Queen delivered a televised address, paying tribute to Diana, while acknowledging the extraordinary reaction her death had stirred. It was one of the rare moments when the monarchy bent to the will of its people, not out of tradition, but out of necessity. Even decades later, that moment is remembered as a tipping point, a time when the gap between the royal family and the public it represented became impossible to ignore. But perhaps the most lasting change brought about by Diana's death wasn't in the institution of the monarchy. It was in the way people viewed the media. The role of the paparazzi in the crash was hard to ignore. Their relentless pursuit of Diana on that final night, a haunting reminder of the price she had paid for living in the public eye. Questions about ethics and accountability in celebrity culture bubbled to the surface. It wasn't just about Diana. It was about an entire industry that had built itself around stripping away the humanity of those it photographed. And while change didn't come overnight, the discussions sparked by her death forced a difficult reckoning within both journalism and the public it served. Ultimately, Diana's death wasn't just the loss of a public figure. It was the loss of possibility. There was a sense that she had so much more to give, so much more good left to do in the world. And yet, even in death, her legacy endured. Her work, her compassion, her humanity remained a blueprint for what came next. Diana had always been someone who used her voice, even when it shook. Someone who had navigated unimaginable pain but still found ways to reach out to others. Her death didn't erase that. If anything, it magnified it. For millions, her story became a reminder of both the beauty and fragility of life, a story they still carry with them today. And for those who knew her, that impact, that quiet insistence on kindness, will always be her greatest legacy. Diana's story wasn't about perfection. It was about being human in a life that asked her to be something else. She wasn't remembered for royal titles or palaces, but for how she made people feel. Her warmth broke through tradition. Her compassion set her apart. But her life was also a reminder of the cost of living in the spotlight, of what happens when a person is stripped of privacy moment by moment. Diana showed us the power of kindness and vulnerability, even when it came at great personal sacrifice. Her legacy isn't just remembered, it's still felt even today.